I really don't see why it's necessary for this government and members of it to put out statements and posts on X and such like that are, in my view, misleading, or in some cases, flat out wrong. I understand, I think, what the effect is that they're going for, but I still think it's wrong. So where do I start? There are so many of these that I sometimes don't know where to start. We'll start with Keir Starmer. I say that because it comes from the Office of the UK Prime Minister account on X here, on this little video that they've put out, which who knows what they've spent on the video, quite frankly, but video production is not cheap. Unlike mine, I just hit record on a camera and start talking. But they say here, we've returned 24,103 people with no right to be here. Now, with great respect to you, without any more thought and just watching this video, you will doubtless come to the conclusion that they have forcibly removed 24,000 people that have no right to be in the UK. Because that's what it says. But even the BBC is now calling this out to be misleading. Now, I'm not for a moment going to suggest that the BBC or anyone at it watches my videos and gets ideas for what to do and what to say, but I said this a long time ago, way back when it was even fewer numbers than it is now. But the BBC is now calling this out, and I have to rejig this so you can actually see it on screen. Even this says, they quote the post, and then they say, the government's latest figures show that only 6,339 of these were enforced returns. Because remember maybe you remember, maybe you won't remember, my previous video when I was talking about this, I said those returns are not all enforced returns. Many of them just had their visa expire, so they left on time, or their visa had expired and they didn't leave on time and they were told to leave, or they had an application refused and so they left, or maybe didn't leave, were told to leave, threatened with deportation and then left, whatever. But only at the time, I think it was 2,000 or 3,000 were enforced returns. Now, the latest figures show, and this is an official government page here that's been updated recently, only 6,339 were enforced returns, not 24,000. So coming back to the point, they put this video out to say, good news, everyone, we've returned 24,103 people with no right to be here. Well, not strictly true, is it? That's somewhat misleading, in my view. And that's not the only one. Let's move on. We move on to our Chancellor, who is saying that people are being paid more. So she says, during the election, we promised to put more money in working people's pockets. At the budget, I announced that we would increase the national minimum and living wage. Those are two separate statutory minimum wages, the national minimum wage, the national living wage, depending on your age. And today, she says, 3 million people will receive that pay boost. Promise made, promise kept. And I say it with a huge dump of sarcasm because the national minimum wage and living wage, since it was introduced, have gone up every year. In fact, we can solicit the use of grok, which is pretty good. Now this puts together, and it says it's showing the UK national minimum wage and national living wage over the last 20 years, focusing on the main adult rate, etc., etc. You can read the caption. And the percentage increase year on year. Now, even the official government documents have a few typos in there and a few digits in the wrong places, but by and large, this is very, very broadly correct. From 2005 and 2006 onwards, you can see the percentage increases, 7.8%, 4.1%, 5.9%, 3.2%, etc. The increases went down. 2016 increase was 10.8%. Now, if we come up to recent years, the last 2 or 3 years, 6.6% increase, 9.7%, 9.8%. This year, 6.7%. So not as much as the previous couple of years. So yes, it's technically correct in that she did promise to increase the national minimum and living wage, and they have gone up. So the promise is kept, but they've gone up every year. And that's not even the main point. Who is it that pays these national minimum and living wages? It's businesses. But who is suffering by paying these wages and employing more people? The same businesses that are paying these increased statutory minimum rates, which, by the way, they've got no choice. It's a statutory minimum. They have to pay these. But they are suffering by employing more people because of the employer national insurance increase, which they said they wouldn't increase. And then they had this whole obfuscation as to, well, we said we weren't going to increase costs on working people. Businesses can get screwed. They can just pay it. Or in her words, to use the more proper terms that she used, we are asking businesses to do more. Is, I think, what she said, which is the way of saying businesses can pick up the tab. But there we are. Now, moving on, there's a bit of a spat between GB News and Mike Tapp, MP for Labour. In fact, let's go to the juicy one. It's where he said here, I won't be lectured by GB News on misleading, given some of the rubbish it pumps out. His words, not mine. Nigel Farage and the Reform Party are a threat to hardworking people and our NHS, he says. Plastic patriots, he says. Now, politics and rough and tumble is what it is. There may be something for Reform and Nigel Farage's lawyers to consider there, but, probably won't go anywhere. It's just political rough and tumble, but they might want to get their lawyers looking at it regardless. But nonetheless, what was all this about? Well, he responded to GB News saying, this is misleading. So let's look at the snippet of the video to see what kicked all this off, and then I'll give you my views on it.
I caught myself looking at your Twitter, and you'd put a tweet out, and I quote, you'd put a picture of the Birmingham Mail, and on the front page of the Birmingham Mail, it was basically criticising Farage's approach to the NHS, and you'd written, and I quote, the media are catching on. Reform at a risk to hard-working people and the precious NHS. That was very misleading, I found, Mike Tapp, because that was a paid-for advertisement by the Labour Party. Wow. So why was you describing an advertisement as some kind of media editorial?
Well, look, I've seen across the board in the media that they're catching on and reporting on the fact that...
wasn't your example.
And reporting on...
So I'll spare you listening to it, but he basically doesn't answer the question. He goes on to generalise and say, well, generally I've seen the media catching on to this idea, but he completely misses or ignores the point. The point being, this was his original tweet. He says, the media are catching on, quote, posting this photograph here, and says, reform is a risk to hardworking people, etc. But the point of this is a photograph of the Birmingham Mail with, and I'll find it for you here, an advert by Labour. Because if you didn't know it was an advert, you might think, as it appears to me that he's implied, the Birmingham Mail has put this as an editorial, when it purportedly quotes Nigel Farage to say we are going to have to move to an insurance-based system of healthcare. But as I said, it's an advert paid for by Labour. So the point of this is, Mike Tapp's tweet here implies, in my view, that this is the Mail's own choice to put this on the front page, when in fact it is a political advert by the Labour Party, which makes it misleading, which is why GB News said it was misleading, which is why he then replied to say, I won't be lectured by GB News on misleading, to which I replied to say, sorry, Mike, but yes, you will. You're a member of Parliament. GB News is not, and you appear to have missed their point entirely or simply ignored it. So let's make it again. You appear to have referred specifically to a paid-for advert by the Labour Party and implied that it was the media catching on. Whether you think that generally is another matter entirely, but to quote post a photograph of the advert in the way that you did is, in my view, clearly misleading, which is what GB News has accused you of. And I agree with GB News, for what it's worth, because it's quite clear that his post implies, to me, in my opinion, quite clear that it implies that Birmingham Mail chose to put that on the front, which they only chose in so much as they accepted the money for the advert. It was an advert on the front of the paper. So again, in my view, that's just misleading. And finally, by way of an update, the case against VAT on school fees has kicked off at the High Court. The Independent Schools Council, Julie Robertson, said this is an unprecedented tax on education. It is right that its compatibility with human rights is tested. We believe that diversity within independent schools has been ignored in the haste to implement this damaging policy, with families and ultimately children bearing the brunt of negative impacts this rushed decision is already having. They say over 10,000 children have been pulled out of private schools, and this hearing is to last for about 3 days, which could have massive repercussions and be a massive defeat for this government if the challenge to it is successful. So subscribe here for further updates and commentary. Do like the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.